Hey everyone, Brendan Sander here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to Albums That Changed the Face of Music, Part 2. There was a Part 1 that posted yesterday, so you can check in the description. I'll leave a link for that. But as we dive into this one here, there are so many things that can go into shaping popular music, culture, what's going on in the world, even how people feel. Sometimes, though, a single album can have a huge overarching effect on the face of music itself. And the thing is, that's the difference between, say, a popular album and one that has actually changed the face of music. And I'm going to run through 10 of those such albums right here, right now. But before we get started, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things help support my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. And of course, if you turn on notifications, you're gonna stay up to date on really cool videos like this about albums that change the face of music. All right, so we're gonna do 10 of these things. Yesterday's episode did A through M, but we're actually going to pick up. There was a few more M titles and stuff that I wanted to do, so we will pick up with M and we will run through the rest of the alphabet, starting with Metallica In The Black album, 1991, fifth studio album, biggest selling metal album, selling over 16 million copies in the US alone. It has spent 550 weeks on the Billboard album chart. It's gone on to popularize metal to the point where people just consider it rock these days, which is kind of crazy. But the thing is that back when this came out, that was at the fall of glam metal, which was the most popular format. Metal was right there behind it. But this actually gave metal music a second life, a second breath, if you will. If you were a metal band or a thrash band, despite all the glam metal bands falling, you could ride this right on and in. So it really helped within the genre change the way people saw it. This album here made being a metal band cool. And suddenly any band that was around that was from the 80s that had done thrash and that sort of stuff, major labels wanted to sign, and so it really had a huge impact across the board, both commercially, amongst bands, the way people saw it in terms of the style and genre and things that were going on. Metal bands were being played up a storm on popular radio, that this stuff was only being played at, after midnight and stuff like that. So this album here, in my opinion, really popularized metal. Right, same time frame, but going in the opposite direction there. Nirvana Nevermind, 1991. Their second studio album, 10 million copies sold in the US with an estimated 30 million copies worldwide. And so this album here, much the way the Black album kind of broke metal, this one here broke grunge onto the national scene. They're not the inventors of it. They didn't start that. They just came from that movement. But it showed a lot of people that you didn't have to wear the stage clothes, put on the over-the-top shows, that you could still do what you do and make it popular and stuff. I mean, it even popularized the flannel shirt. That was not something that was typically worn as part of stage gear, especially from glam metal bands and stuff like that. But so all in all, the album breaking a new musical genre onto the national scene, but also changing the way people thought about rock stars and so forth, having another huge impact and helping to usher in all kinds of other types of alternative music and so forth. All right, next one up goes to another band of the same genre, Pearl Jam 10, 1991. So a lot of albums of that year. It's a big major year, right? Debut studio album from Pearl Jam, sold over 13 million copies in the US alone. And so again, pretty much the same way that Nirvana, broke the grunge scene and all of that, this album here was helping to do that as well. You can't really put it all on Nirvana. There was a number of bands that did it, but two of the absolute biggest bands to come out of that and commercially and with their impact and so forth, Pearl Jam being another one of them. But the difference here is that in the way that I see Pearl Jam is that's essentially my generation's Led Zeppelin. They had much more in line with classic 70s rock sound than say Nirvana did or some of these other grunge bands and things that came out, and what they blended in, and they still played the guitar was up front and so forth. So it was a great melding of guitar rock, but taken into that new genre of grunge and so forth. And that continued on, and with the band having its longevity and being around and being able to keep the sound of grunge and so forth in the forefront of popular culture is another reason why I say that this album here had such impact. All right, next one. Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon from 1973, 8th studio album from the band, 15 million copies sold in the US with an estimated 45 million copies sold around the world. It's also the longest running album on the Billboard 200 album chart, with over 962 weeks being on the chart. And that in and of itself, I think, warrants it, the same way that in the last episode we talked about Led Zeppelin and Stairway to Heaven and so forth. This is one where the album just in and of itself has infused itself into popular culture and is just talked about everywhere. Sure, it's a huge popular album, but it's just one of those albums that seems to have legs for days and go on and influence everything that it touches year after year after year, and is not just something that is only defined from the 70s. It has gone on to have that same impact in the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s. It's still doing it today. Major, songs off of this thing that we hear in all different types of ways that people cover. Breathe, Money, Time. People love the song Great Gig in the Sky. That was an entirely different style of something that could come out and be a popular song, having no discernible lyric to it, but yet having a vocalist sing over something that gave it a definable sound and so forth. Okay, next one up. Queen, News of the World, 1977, their 6th studio album, selling 4 million copies in the US. And we're going to just jump right into the songs on this thing, because Queen in and of itself, we could almost pick any Queen album to be part of this list here for what they did with rock music, bringing that theatrical side into it. But they were also a genre-bending band, and so there's lots of that stuff across the board. I ultimately chose this album here because of the 1-2 punch of We Will Rock You and We Are the Champions. Those songs have had such a huge impact across the board. They're both songs that get played in sports arenas and as anthems and of stuff like that. But both of those songs are very different stylistic type songs. And we have the We Will Rock You, which is just, the stomping of the foot and so forth with a very little bit of guitar until the guitar solo. And it was just a classic case of what Queen could do. They could write songs that didn't follow typical formula and yet be really big popular songs. And then on top of that, having the huge impact that they have on so many other bands. There's so many different groups and artists out there that claim the impact of Queen. One of them being Guns N' Roses' Axl Rose, where we almost don't hear that in their music, but yet it is something that is talked about all the time by Axl Rose. And so Queen just being one of those bands, I've chosen to go with News of the World. Okay, next one up. Quiet Riot, Metal Health, 1983, their 3rd studio album. First metal album to reach #1 on the Billboard 200 album chart, and that is the main reason that I'm going with it here. It would go on to sell 6 million copies in the US, and while the name Quiet Riot maybe doesn't scream the impact and so forth that we think of and why it should make this list, the album itself popularized heavy metal for the masses back in 1983 and 84 when it had come out. And being the fact that it went to #1, nobody thought that metal could be that way, could be a popular form of music. It was still something that was underground and so forth. But in 1983, when the album was released, and I'm sure it didn't actually peak at #1 until into 1984, it's changed everything. And suddenly record labels were going out and signing every metal band and glam metal band, whatever you want to sort of call that sort of stuff, and really pushing behind it to see if they could get the same sort of results, ultimately leading to where things went with the rise of glam metal and popular metal, and ultimately Metallica's Black Album and so forth and stuff like that. But to me, this is the genesis of it here. Okay, next one up. Sex Pistols, Nevermind the Bollocks. 1977 one and only album. We're not going to count the live albums and stuff like that and archival releases, but their one and only studio album that they've released. So despite the band essentially imploding upon impact, the release of this album here, it's crazy the amount of impact that this album would go on to have. Really just smashing the establishment at the time, beginning the end of the era for prog rock music, which was the popular dominant form of rock at the time. And ultimately just being one of those albums that you hear so many people cite. You get metal bands covering it. You get, Megadeth cover Anarchy in the UK. Motley Crue's covered Anarchy in the UK. And there's numerous other songs on here that to the same degree that people have covered. But a Sex Pistols song on a covers album is just almost a given these days. And so the album really hasn't sold that many copies. And again, showing that it's not always a popular album that we're talking about. We're talking about the impact. And I think this album has had a huge impact on the music scene in general beyond what it has done just in terms of its sales. Another one of such albums just happens to be that it's letter S and coming right after it, but the Stooges and Raw Power from 1973. Maybe this album here impacting the Sex Pistols, but third studio album by the Stooges, produced by David Bowie. So, that in and of itself was pretty cool. But it's just one of those albums that is cited by virtually every British punk band that came out after it. And the album itself has not sold a lot. In fact, I didn't even have a certification for it to be able to tell you what it has sold. I'm sure it has sold a significant amount, and it may not be one of those ones where the record label has chosen to go after it because it actually costs money to get those certifications. So maybe that's why. But the impact of what this album would have on other bands, those bands would become popular and so forth, is the reason why I'm actually choosing to include it here in this list. All right, we're down to the last two that I'm going to do here, and one album that has had a huge impact across the board, Van Halen, self-titled album from 1978, or known as Van Halen 1, debut studio album, 10 million copies sold in the US, one of the greatest all-time debut albums ever. That in and of itself could be the thing, but it was the fact that I think it created the biggest shift in the genre at the time, and ultimately leading to the explosion of 80s rock music and then glam metal and guitar shredding and so forth, having a huge impact across the board just on that. But I want to take it even further and talk about the song Eruption and that 1 minute and 42 second instrumental guitar shred piece by Eddie Van Halen himself has just had a huge impact across the board on guitar players as well, probably equally as much as Jimi Hendrix has. So you got these two guys here just doing crazy things in terms of the world of guitar and leading to an explosion of future guitar players that would cite these guys as influence and so forth. All right, and the last one here that we're going to talk about, The Who, Tommy, from 1969, their fourth studio album, 2 million copies sold in the US. Concept album that popularized the rock opera, one of the very first ones doing such things. Ultimately, what was interesting, it would be converted into a film in 1975, long before Pink Floyd's The Wall. It would be converted into a Broadway musical in 1992, long before other rock bands had such things going on like Queen and ABBA and so forth. And now I realize that that's just become a popular thing, but they can look back at an album like this having those sort of impacts and stuff like that. And while not really my overall favorite Who album, I think Who's Next is my favorite in that, and is a more straight ahead rock album. This one here is the one that really had the impact on the music industry and on future bands. And again, what could be done with an album, that idea, the concept, the storytelling, and so forth like that, and then how it could actually move out into popular culture and impact other things outside of just rock music. And this album here is one such album that did just that. But there you go. There are 10 albums that changed the face of music. Again, this was part 2. There was a part 1. So you heard me talk about Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix and stuff, and they appear in the first one. So if you want to go back to that, there is a link in the description. But we covered in all from both videos 20 albums that changed the face of music. Watch those, but let me know your thoughts here. I'm sure there are tons of other albums that you guys have in mind and so forth. There was other ones on the list that I wanted to give a shout out to. I almost put Tesla's 5-Man acoustical jam in here for being one of the things that popularized the acoustic album and so forth. But I had to pull some things because there were just other ones that I felt that had bigger impact and so forth. But let me know your thoughts. Otherwise, have a great one. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye, everyone.